Right, good morning, everybody. Thank you so much for attending and making the effort to come out here this morning. This is a bit of a kind of a partnership project and event over the next few days. So obviously hosted by Careys Secret Garden. Some of you might have been here before. Anyone never been here before? Nice few people. Also in partnership with the Sound Approach, who some of you may or may not know, but we've got the Sound Approach team just down here, who a collective of sound recordists that have been recording bird sound for more than 25 years and have amassed one of the largest private bird sound archives in the world. And then also support with Birds of Poole Harbour as well. We're going to be doing some work in partnership with the ringing demos and doing some talks as well. So we've got a really nice series of events over the next 3 days. And we'll get straight into it with the first talk of the event this morning. And really, great to welcome Chris Hewson here from the BTO. So the BTO, the British Trust for Ornithology, do incredible amounts of scientific work. Good morning. Grab a seat. Across the country. And so we've been working on and off with the BTO in different capacities over the last, almost 2 decades, really. And Chris is going to be here this morning talking to us about summer migrants, tracking summer migrants and understanding why they are struggling so much. So can we give Chris a big round of applause and hand over to you?
Thanks, Fulton. Hello, everybody. So the title of my talk is Tracking Our Summer Migrants to Understand Population Declines. And first of all, I'm going to give you some background as to why we're doing this work in the form of this graph here, which shows the population changes of migrants according to the Breeding Bird Survey. And you can see we've got bars going off to the right showing population increases, and we've got bars going off to the left showing population declines. And the first thing to notice is that we've got a number of substantial bars going off to the left here, which show the recent population declines of some of our most popular and well-known migrant species. So we have the nightingale, an iconic species famed for the quality of its song in poetry and literature, and that's undergone a catastrophic decline of 90% in the last 55 years. So in other words, since I was born, 9 out of 10 nightingales that were breeding here then have now disappeared. And that's an ongoing decline. In the last quarter of a century, we've lost 40% of the nightingales that were here then. Next, the swifts, a fantastic aerial species. It might be continuously flying for 9 or 10 months of the year before coming back to nest in the roof cavities of our houses. And across both the UK and England specifically, that's undergone a 66% decline in 27 years. So in other words, in just over the last quarter of a century, we've lost 2/3 of our swifts. Next, the spotted flycatcher, less well known to the general public than the other 2 species, but nonetheless very popular on account of its eye-catching behaviour and its habit of coming to nest in our gardens, even on our houses sometimes. And that's undergone a truly catastrophic decline of 93% in the last 55 years. And that's an ongoing decline. We've lost 2/3 of our spotted flycatchers in the last 25 years as well. So really just a tiny number left compared to what there were. And then finally, the cuckoo, the iconic harbinger of spring, that's undergone a massive decline of 78% in the last 55 years in England. More recently, across the UK as a whole, we've lost about 1/3 of our cuckoos, but this masks quite strong regional divergence. So in the last 15 years since we started our cuckoo tracking project, the decline in England has continued, but in Scotland there's been a bit of a resurgence with almost a 2/3 increase in that period. And this sort of regional divergence has been really quite useful for us in trying to work out why the population overall is in decline. So if we return to this graph and we colour in the bars according to where species spend the winter, you can see that the colours aren't evenly distributed across the graph. And that's because there's relationships between where species spend the winter and their recent population changes. So to go through these groups, first we've got in purple, we've got the northern wintering species like the blackcap. So these are species which winter in North Africa and southern Europe, north of the Sahara. And then next we've got the arid zone species. So these are species which winter in the Sahel, just south of the Sahara Desert. And they include the yellow wagtail, the wheatear, the whitethroat and the redstart. And then the next group in green is the humid zone wintering species. So these are species which winter in the equatorial humid tropics of West and Central Africa. And they include the wood warbler, the nightingale, the cuckoo and the reed warbler. And then finally, we've got the southern African wintering species. So they winter well south in the southern part of the continent, and they include the swift, the hobby, and the swallow. Now, if we group together all the species in each of these groups and produce trend graphs, we end up with something that looks like this. And you can see that we have got in purple the recent increases of the northern zone winterers, so blackcaps, chiffchaffs. In orange, we've got the population fluctuations of the arid zone species that we've already looked at. In red, recent very stable populations of resident species, so those which are with us all year. And then we've got a long, slow decline of the southern African species and a more steep and sustained decline of the humid zone wintering species. And trying to understand these different trajectories has been a large part of the work that the BTO has been doing in recent years. Some of them are relatively easy to get a handle on, at least to some extent. This graph here shows Sahel precipitation from 1900 to 2015. We've got bars going up showing wet years, bars going down showing dry years. I want to draw your attention to three different events. And the first is a severe drought in the late 1960s and 1970s. Secondly, a much more severe or even more severe droughts in the 1980s. And then third, in 2009, the wettest year since the droughts began. And if we superimpose the population trends of the arid zone species on top of here, you can see that there's a very strong correspondence. And so we've got quite strong confidence that rainfall in the Sahel is driving at least the population fluctuations of those species. But it's been trying to understand these two lines here, the decline of the southern winterers and particularly the stronger decline of the humid zone winterers, which has been a particular focus for the BTO's work. And we've used tracking as a tool to do this in recent years. It's only become possible to do that because of the advances in tracking technology. And this graph here, which shows the log of the number of papers published on tracking Palearctic migrants across a number of years, all migrants across years from 1962 to 2017, shows a nice straight line, which means we've got an exponential increase in the number of tracking papers that are being published, the amount of information that's being generated, and therefore our knowledge about the migrations of these birds due to advances in tracking technology. So the first species that we focused on is the nightingale, which we tracked using light level geolocators. You can see a light stalk sticking out of the back of the tag, which is embedded in the feathers nicely there. And geolocators are our smallest devices, and they've been miniaturized massively in recent years. And this has enabled us to track a number of small birds for the first time. Nightingale was a really important one for us to do because we knew very little about nightingales and where they spent the winter based on ringing recoveries. We only had 4 ringing recoveries of nightingales in winter, but they were all in the second half of September, and probably not surprisingly, they were all in Europe. So it told us nothing at all about their migrations in Africa. So light level geolocators, they're basically light level recorders which record light intensity every 2 minutes against a very accurate clock and calendar. And the data that we get looks something like this. You can see 3 different daily cycles. We've got increasing and then decreasing light levels. We've got knots of noise from the species like a nightingale because it's going in and out of habitat and things like that. They've got a number of disadvantages. Though they're very small, they've got a number of disadvantages compared to other devices. We can't track the birds very accurately, and latitude in particular is dependent upon calibration for its accuracy. And I'll show you what I mean by that. So this red line here, horizontal red line, shows the threshold that we use for defining our dawn and dusk events. We've got in green, we've got a dawn, and in red, we've got a dusk event. And the time between the two is day length, which can tell us how far north or south the bird is. But this only works if we can relate this to an astronomical event. In other words, how far above or below the horizon was the sun when this threshold was passed. And that's actually quite difficult to do. In contrast, the midpoint between our defined dawn and dusk is what we call solar midday, and this gives us longitude. So we've got 360 degrees around the Earth as it rotates on its axis, 24 hours in a day. So for every hour that solar midday has shifted, the bird has moved 15 degrees around the Earth's surface. And the result of all this is that longitude and the timing of movements are much easier to determine than latitude. Another big drawback of these devices, of course, is that they don't transmit any information, which means that we have to catch the bird and retrieve the device to download the data. So we only get birds that complete the annual cycle giving us any data. And very often that's the half of the story which is probably less important for understanding population declines, as I hope to show you later. So first of all, we asked ourselves, where do breeding nightingales spend the winter? And we found that they're very strongly clustered in the far western part of the known wintering range on the coast of Senegal, Gambia, and Guinea-Bissau in particular. And in fact, they are incredibly clustered. A population spread of 388 kilometres, which is the mean distance between each pair of those birds. If you think about pairing each one up with every other bird, that's the mean distance between them. This is not only highly significantly smaller than for other populations of nightingales that have been tracked from France, Italy, and Bulgaria, but it's also smaller than for any other known population of migratory bird anywhere that's been tracked in the world. So these birds are unusually clustered in an extremely small area, and this leaves them vulnerable to climate change because it means that across the whole population, these birds are encountering a relatively small spread of environmental conditions. So if the climate in one particular year or changes to be unsuitable, there's little variation and they all could be affected negatively. Similarly, the amount of habitat, as you'll show you in a couple of slides' time, that's available to these birds is very small in such a restricted area. So any habitat destruction can have a disproportionately big effect on such a clustered population. You see here the blue of the birds, but we also got Cartong Bird Observatory, which we've paired up with later on. So not only were these birds clustered, but they're also separated from other populations. We've got 4 populations which have now been tracked across Europe, and we had strong migratory connectivity, which means that the spatial relationships of the breeding population has been maintained in the non-breeding areas. So in other words, birds from the northwestern part of the range in the breeding range went to the northwestern part of the wintering range. And in fact, 91% of that variation is maintained, which is incredibly high. So not only are they very clustered, but they're also separated from other populations. So we thought we could use this to look and see at the habitat suitability of our population versus others. And to do this, we use a species distribution model using field data. So this is things like people who put in coordinates of where they've seen nightingales into eBird and things like that, various other atlases, and also any surveys that have been undertaken as part of research. We collated all that information, and then Myri Kirkland from the BTO did an incredibly clever model and came up with a habitat suitability map, which looks like this. You can see we've got the most suitable areas in dark green, going to the less suitable areas through browns and then into paler colours. As we predicted in advance, the transition zone between the forest and the savannas is the key area. But our birds are off here to the northwest. And in fact, we found that the habitat suitability for the UK population was significantly lower than for the other European populations, both in 2001 and 2020, the beginning and end of the period we were able to address. And not only that, there was evidence that the UK population area is declining in suitability even across this area, and for a number of reasons. We think over the previous 30 years or so it will have declined even more. Due to the droughts, there have been irreversible changes due to increasing population pressure.
Brexit.
Well, yeah, it's responsible for most things, so I'm sure it's been part of it, definitely. Irreversible changes in desertification, increased goat grazing because there's a higher human population. So they're not only clustered, but they're in poorer habitat, and that habitat is declining. So next we asked ourselves, which other populations do UK breeding nightingales mix with? And this is important for a couple of reasons. First of all, for population regulation. So in other words, it's not just the British population going there, but if there are other populations going there, then obviously they're competing for resources, and that could have an impact on our birds. So we need to understand about that. But secondly, simply for knowing what other populations would be affected by the environmental conditions in the wintering areas that our birds are exposed to. And to do this, we did reciprocal tagging in Africa, in Cartong Bird Observatory, which was in the area where the British nightingales have been tracked to, and in Ghana, which is in the overlap zone between where the Italian and French population zone have been tracked to. And first of all, we found that most or all, but probably all, nightingales tracked from the Gambia breed in England. The red dots here show birds tagged at Cartong Bird Observatory. 3 of them here are the same birds. We know that nightingales don't disperse very much or very rarely in the between breeding seasons, so it's likely to be fair, we can take an average of those 3 different locations. It does show how much variation you get from geolocators, and not like GPS tags, obviously. In blue, we've got birds tagged in the UK at these 4 sites. So we know they were breeding at these 4 sites, and we use exactly the same methods to try and work out where the geolocators say they're breeding. And you can see there's a lot of spread here. And actually, when you take an average for those birds, there's a complete overlap between the two. We've got 2 birds that we track with GPS tags from the Gambia, and we know exactly where they were breeding. So within a few meters, we can actually see the shape of their territories. It's quite nice. And they were both, one was in Sussex and one was in Suffolk. And then we've also got, since this project started, and we've been working with KBO, 6 ringing exchanges, 110 nightingales trapped at the Gambia. 6 of them either had rings on. Actually, one had one of our GPS tags on, which was pretty amazing. Or were subsequently caught in the UK, having been ringed in the Gambia. So we've got very strong confidence that there's an extremely strong link between the Gambia and England. So what we need to do after this, we've got some handle on other, beginning to get some handle on other populations that might be, or in this case, not mixing in the wintering grounds. We look at what's called migratory networks. These are complex patterns of connectivity across different populations. This is really important for understanding how populations will interact with each other, as well as the extent to which impacts on the non-breeding grounds might be impacting breeding populations. So I mentioned we tagged some birds in the Gambia and in Ghana, despite someone very helpfully clearing half the habitat that we'd tagged the birds in between the following one winter and the following winter. We did get 3 tags back, and 2 of them wintered in North Africa and 1 in central Italy. In contrast, so with a population spread, the average difference between them, 1,225. So these birds were very well spread out. In contrast, the birds tracked from the Gambia, all, as we've already seen, went to England. We're pretty sure the population spread was only 462, so just a quarter of the population spread of the other birds. If we combine all the sources of information we have, including ringing recoveries and also the tagging locations of birds that were tracked down to this to include this site in Ghana, we end up with source populations like this. A tiny one, which is probably too big even. Tiny, almost certainly, because of the way we've got a land mask which forces it onto the land. These northern French ones are probably English ones, we think. Tiny one for the for the Gambian population, and a much bigger one. In fact, 43,000 kilometres for the Gambia, 500 million for Ghana. So there's a massive difference. The UK birds are much more concentrated, and what this means is any impacts down here will be concentrated in a much smaller breeding populations. They'll be less spread out, which means they'll be more detectable. And in fact, we think they're more likely to occur at all, because you've got a thing called the buffer effect, which means that there are spare birds floating around. And if the impacts here are spread out, then spare birds can fill in. If they're all concentrated in a small area, then you're drilling through the spare birds, and that's when you begin to get a population impact. And so these findings about UK birds being very tightly clustered in poor and declining habitat, and the likelihood of it impacting the breeding population, actually reflects exactly what we see in Europe, according to Birds in Europe 2, published by BirdLife. You can see a dark red downward arrow here, which shows a long-term severe decline in the UK. No other country has that. Belgium had a smaller long-term decline, but actually that's levelled out in recent decades. So it's just the UK, which fits exactly what we found by looking at the wintering locations of these birds. Now, I mentioned that the advantage of geolocators is that they're the smallest tracking device that we have. They're even smaller than this now, but this was about 8 years ago. We had the smallest one, which was about 1/3 of a gram, and this meant we could put it on any of our birds almost. Some of our smallest migrants, including wood warblers and spotted flycatchers. On a wood warbler, it's less than 4% of body weight. On a spotted flycatcher, it's less than 3%. So we can put them on these birds and have fairly good confidence that we're not going to have too severe an impact on them, which is obviously the name of the game, because there's no point getting data that doesn't tell you what these birds do under natural conditions. So I just want to quickly show you the migrations of these birds. To me, they were a bit mind-boggling and completely unexpected. Typical spotted flycatcher leaves the UK in a southwesterly direction. It spends 1 to 3 weeks of stopover, probably in Portugal or in Morocco. Crosses the Sahara, spends about 1 to 3 weeks when it gets to the other side before moving slowly eastwards. Has a short stopover on the northern side of the Congo Basin, and then hops over the Congo Basin to its final wintering location, which is all the way down here in Namibia. We used to think it was in Angola, but now latest analyses suggest it's almost certainly in Namibia. So they go even further than we thought. The beginning of spring migration is a northward migration. So it's a latitudinal migration, and it's around the equinox, which means that we can't pick it up with geolocators, but we next pick these birds up in the first half of April as they're moving westwards through the longitudes of West Africa. They have a stopover in a similar area of West Africa for 2 or 3 weeks, fattening up, ready for the northward crossing of the Sahara. And then in early to mid-May, surprisingly late, actually, people thought their spot flies were coming back earlier than they actually are, according to the light level data in a number of cases. They then cross the Sahara and then move rapidly back to the breeding grounds. And overall, this, I said 22,000, it's probably a bit longer actually with this updated wintering location. But it's a round trip of 22,000 kilometres, partly because of this big dog leg that the birds are doing. They're not just flying straight across, they're doing this double dog leg in spring and autumn. 22,000 kilometres in a year. And bear in mind that this bird weighs about the same as a pound coin. So it's a really very small thing indeed. Quite an amazing migration. Quickly, the wood warbler, they did what we expected them to do based on ringing recoveries, and that's that they left the UK in a southeasterly direction to a stopover in central Italy, where they prepared for the southward crossing of the Sahara. Beyond that, we didn't know anything really from ringing recoveries. But now we found out that all the birds we've tracked crossed the desert slightly east of south, which was interesting. I don't know quite why they do that. Early to mid-September. And then the question was, would they move southwards into the Congo rainforest or westwards into the smaller rainforest area of West Africa? A previous study based on isotopes of feathers collected in the breeding grounds in England had suggested that they were much more likely to winter in the Congo. There's only a tiny number of suitable pixels for them over here. So that was considered a fait accompli that they would winter in the Congo basin. But actually, the proof of the pudding in the tracking shows that they didn't do that at all. They moved westwards, stopped over in the Sahara in sort of late autumn when that's beginning to dry out. And then they moved on to a forest area in Liberia, Sierra Leone, that sort of area, where they stayed throughout the winter, from sort of late autumn, early winter, before making a rapid movement straight back to the breeding grounds at the end of the winter period. Other species that we've been able to find out new information on is the swift. This shows the track, a purple line showing the autumn migration southwards. In yellow, we have the wintering movements from the Congo in mid-August. And then in spring, we have the blue movements. Red shows the winter ringing recoveries of UK breeding swifts. And you can see that actually the ringing recoveries in this case have picked out the wintering area very well. Unfortunately, mostly because young boys like to catch them to eat them using grasshoppers on a line with a stick. That's a large part of the reason, sadly. But nonetheless, what we didn't know was that a single swift actually would trace this entire area throughout the winter due to its movements. It makes sense. Swifts are highly aerial species. They can't hold territories. They just go where the food is. Another thing that we found out was this movement you can see here at the beginning of spring migration. So the birds arrive in the Congo, go down to Mozambique, to return to the Congo, they begin a spring migration, they make a rapid movement. In fact, it's not over the sea. That was an artifact of geolocators we've been able to show. I won't explain why. It's very interesting, but probably a bit boring right now. but nonetheless, it's this important stop over here where British swifts spend a couple of weeks fattening up for the northward crossing of the Sahara. And actually, bringing recovery, we had some in the Congo, some in northwest Africa. It was assumed that they moved straight across because there was no trace of this whatsoever. But this is actually a really important area. And without tracking, we would have had no idea at all that our birds were doing that. So geolocators have to be retrieved, which means that they're not very good for looking at patterns of mortality, which means they're not very good for population studies. However, the common cuckoo is an excellent model species for population studies on Afro-Palearctic migrants. Partly, as I mentioned before, it's got a declining population in Britain. Secondly, it's the largest small nocturnal migrant, which means it's the first one that we've been able to track using satellite tracking technology, as that's got smaller and smaller. And as I'll show you, that has a number of advantages over other types of tracking technology. And then thirdly, its migration is very poorly known, or at least it was very poorly known when we started this project. We knew, or at least we thought we knew from ringing recoveries, that the birds left the UK in a southeasterly direction at the end of the breeding season. But beyond that, we had virtually no information. In fact, the only piece of information we had was this ringing recovery of a juvenile ringed in a pied wagtails test in June 1928, which was recovered in Cameroon in late January 1930, having been taken by man for the pot. However, it's the advent of new technology specifically this 5-gram satellite tag from microwave telemetry, which has enabled us to basically revolutionise our understanding of cuckoo migration. So these tags are solely powered with a rechargeable battery. You can see these solar cells on the back here, and they transmit even very constant signals for 10 hours at a time, which can be picked up by satellites passing overhead. And the way the signal changes as the satellite moves relative to the tag, the Doppler effect, enables the satellite system, some very clever people in France, to estimate whereabouts on the ground or close to the ground the tag is. And then the tag switches off for 48 hours to allow the solar cell to recharge the battery so we can repeat the cycle. The result of this is that we get unbiased information. There's no need for recapture, which means that we get to find out not only where every bird goes, but also where it dies. And this, as I'll show you, is incredibly important for understanding the population decline. The result of all this taken together is that we get close to real-time tracking across the entire annual cycle. And this has been a real boon to the BTO in terms of public engagement, because we've put these tracks on our website every day, which means that the general public's been able to follow the migrations of these birds and the research as it's unfolded. But to track a cuckoo, first you've got to catch a cuckoo, and this shows our catching setup. We've got a rather battered female stuffed cuckoo here on a stick. Underneath, we've got out of sight, we've got some sound lures, and the idea, which the sound lures playing the sounds of males and female cuckoos indulging in mating, cuckoo orgy tape we call it. We play these lures and set up this system. You can see in the back some black lines and some mesh, hopefully, which shows the mist nets that we surround this setup with. And the idea is that the cuckoos will, male cuckoos will see and hear these lures and be so keen to get there and get involved in the action that they don't see the nets and we catch them. Sometimes they just come and sit on top of an adjacent tree and effectively laugh at us, which can be very frustrating. But sometimes it does work very well, as you can see here, where myself and colleagues, Phil Atkinson from the BTO and Tony Cross from Wales, volunteer ringer, have each got a cuckoo ready for tagging. So this map shows the population changes of cuckoos according to the Breeding Bird Survey. We've got blue showing population increases and red showing population decreases. And it's against this background that in 2011 we tagged our first 5 birds in East Anglia, partly because it's close to our headquarters in Thetford in Norfolk, but also because it's right in the heart of the zone of greatest decline of cuckoos. And straight away, we found that the first 5 birds, the 3 of them did something which was expected based on ringing recoveries, and that's that they headed off southeast to a stopover here in the Po watershed in northern Italy, which we're able to confirm is indeed a really important stopover for our cuckoos on the way to Italy. But 2 birds represented by this orange and pale blue lines did something completely different, and that's that they left Europe in a southwesterly direction and entered Africa at the far western part of tropical Africa. And this was completely unexpected because we'd never even had a ringing recovery that was west of where the cuckoo had been tagged. And what's more, these birds then converged on the same routes as the other birds and ended up wintering in exactly the same spot, which is unexpected again because normally if birds take different migration routes, they'd end up in different places, a process known as migratory connectivity. So over the next few years of the study, we tracked birds from a number of locations across the UK, stratified not only by population change, but also by latitude and the upland-lowland habitat division. And this map, hopefully you can see, we've got some red lines showing the migrations of birds which took the southeastern route via Italy, and we've got some yellow lines which took a southwestern route via Spain. And across these first few years, we had 23 journeys by 20 birds taking the western route, 33 journeys by 22 birds taking the eastern route. And we found that there was a significant difference in survival between the birds taking the 2 routes. The modelled estimates suggest that a bit over half of the birds which take the route via Spain across these years survived to reach tropical Africa, whereas nearly all of the birds which migrated via Italy did so. And not only are these birds surviving differently, but they're also distributed differently across the UK. So we've got a pie chart on this graph map for every tagged population. In red, we've got birds migrating southeast, in yellow, southwest. And you can see that in the Highlands of Scotland and Wales, all of the birds that we've tracked migrated southeast via Italy, which is what birds from most of Northern Europe do. Whereas across the rest of England, there was a mixture of birds taking the 2 routes, except for in Sherwood Forest, where the initial population all migrated southwest via Spain. The background to this map shows the population changes of cuckoos between the last two breeding atlases, and we drew a buffer around each tagging location, and we found that there was a very strong correspondence between the degree of local population decline and the proportion of birds which took this more dangerous route via Spain. And this held not only across the entire set, but also within upland and within lowland, which gives us quite a lot of confidence that this extra mortality on the route via Spain is contributing to the population declines that we're seeing in the country. Now, this map shows the mortality locations across these years, and you can see that a number of birds taking the southwestern route all died in either southwest France, they'd both been in Spain, or Spain before they'd even started off on their migrations. And in years when the droughts and wildfires which occur in late summer have been particularly bad in Spain, none of the birds which took this route at all made it across the Sahara. So conditions in southern Europe, in Spain in particular, seem to be important in driving this difference in survival. However, we must remember that these birds come from the parts of the UK, i.e. the Midlands and the south of England, where the declines of the moths which produce the large hairy caterpillars, which are the favoured food of the cuckoo, have been most severe. So it's possible that conditions in the UK were also contributing to this difference in survival. So over the last several years, we've been concentrating on tagging birds from the parts of the UK where we can expect both southeast and southwestern birds to try and work out what's going on. So the idea is to see how survival is affected by first the route-specific effects of conditions in the UK, because the extent to which that's important may differ. Secondly, conditions in southern Europe, so Spain or Italy, depending upon which route the birds are taking. And then thirdly, an interaction between the two. Now, this is going to be really important in understanding how environmental conditions are driving this difference in survival. In terms of its relationship to the population decline, some work that we've done with Claire Buchan at the University of East Anglia has been really informative. In a prior project, Claire had produced these 4 maps of what she calls potential threat surfaces. So we've got direct mortality, so that's the presence of infrastructure like buildings and power lines that birds can fly into, habitat change, and then 2 indexes of climate change, one for the breeding and one for the non-breeding seasons. And what Claire did was she overlaid the cuckoo tracks onto these surfaces to look at the differences in threat exposure between these birds, and then divided it down by season. And interestingly, what she found when she laid it over the winter period was by looking at the longitude of the southbound migration versus exposure to potential threats in Africa, for all 3 threats, so direct mortality threats, potential threats, habitat change, and climate change, birds taking the more westerly routes were exposed to a greater degree of potential threat in Africa than birds taking more easterly routes. So it may not just be in Europe, but also in Africa that these birds are exposed to more danger. So I mentioned that all of the birds wintered in the same area, and that area is this area here, which is the western part of the Congo Basin, the Congo rainforest in Central Africa. This was previously thought to be really inhospitable to migrants. So rainforests aren't very seasonal, which means there aren't big seasonal peaks of resources that migrants can exploit that residents are limited by resource bottlenecks from exploiting. But we found that not just our cuckoos, but also some of our swifts winter there or around there, but certainly even in there. Nightjars, tracked by Greg Conway and Ian from the BTO, and also Brian Cresswell from down here, they've wintered around this area. And then, to me, most surprisingly of all, the corn crates that Rhys Green tracked from the Western Isles, rather than winter in southeastern Africa, Zimbabwe, as was previously thought, they actually winter in this area too, presumably in grassy openings which have been created by elephants and large herbivores like that. So if we zoom in a little bit, 4 of the first 5 birds did something which has become unusual in recent years, and that's that they wintered in this area called the Teke Plateau, which is in Congo and Gabon. And it's actually, although it's in the rainforest area climatically, it's got very sandy soil, so it's only got forests in streaks along the watercourses. Otherwise, it's a savanna area, but our birds are on the edge of the forest there. But the 5th bird, Chris the cuckoo, named after Chris Packham, did something different, which is much more typical of other birds, and that's that it wintered in the western Congolian swamp forests, which are some of the wettest forests in the Congo Basin. This picture was sent to me by a chap called Hugo Rainey, who worked there for the WWF, This is what it looks like in the dry season. And Hugo told us that the specific patch of habitat that Chris the cuckoo was wintering in was thought to have the highest density of western lowland gorillas anywhere in the world. Certainly, to me, it was a bit of an eye-opener to think that the cuckoos that I hear in my house or around my house just outside Cambridge have been spending the winter rubbing shoulders with gorillas. Now, if you look at Google Earth, you can see that the Congo rainforest is pretty much intact. There's been some small-scale opening up for settlements, roads, small-scale logging, such as in this picture taken by Toby Smith from the Cambridge Conservation Initiative photographer who went to chase cuckoos for us in Gabon. But overall, because we know that cuckoos like edges of forest, we don't think that the amount of habitat degradation is impacting them there. In fact, it may even be beneficial for them at the moment. Obviously, if the Congo keeps getting opened up, that won't be the case. But at the moment, we don't think that's the place to look for the causes of the population decline of the UK population. Now, at the end of the winter, the birds headed off in a northwesterly direction. We lost our first bird here in an extremely similar place and date to that first ringing recovery, remarkably, in January 1930 of the bird that had been ringed in a pied wagtail's nest. Unfortunately, this was the bird named Clement after Andy Clements, the CEO of the BTO. But nonetheless, despite Andy's bird not making it, the other 4 birds did continue to a stop over here in Ghana and Ivory Coast, where they spent about a month fattening up, ready for the northward crossing of the Sahara. Now this, as you'll recall, hopefully, is similar to what the swifts did. And this was particularly interesting for us because swift and cuckoo are 2 of the species which have undergone substantial population declines at the same time as failing to advance their arrival date back to the UK in line with other springs, as many other species have done. And we know that if you look across Europe and even beyond, and North America as well, those species which haven't advanced their arrival date in line with global warming have undergone bigger population declines than other species. So we needed to look at this in a lot more detail. And the fact that these 2 birds are the only 2 birds that haven't really advanced their arrival date very much, but doing this dogleg into West Africa was a particular interest to us. So we asked 2 questions. Firstly, why has the cuckoo not advanced its arrival date back to the UK in earlier springs? We know that some birds have and some birds haven't, but because of the lack of tracking data, we don't know why that is, or we didn't know why that is. And secondly, what are the consequences of this throughout the annual cycle? So there's been relatively little support for the expected demographic drivers of this, which is that birds get back too late, they miss the seasonal resource peaks, so there's less food for them, so they breed less successfully. But that hasn't been borne out, so we don't really know why. So we were wondering, well, maybe they're able to compensate for this and they suffer elsewhere in the annual cycle. And to answer these questions, or to address them, we divided the annual cycle up into 6 stages. On each of these maps, you can see we've got orange for the Sahara, we've got dark green for the wintering area, and black dots show the locations of the birds. We've got the breeding grounds residency at the top, the wintering grounds at the bottom, and then we've got migration through Europe and across the Sahara to tropical Africa, migration through tropical Africa to the wintering grounds. After the wintering grounds residency, we've got migration through tropical Africa again, and then we've got the northward crossing of the Sahara, migration through Europe back to the breeding grounds. And what we did was we defined an event which represented the birds transitioning between each of these pairs of annual cycle stages. And when you do that, you end up with something like this. You've got departure from the breeding grounds, completion of the southbound Sahara crossing, arrival on the wintering grounds. I think I've run the battery out. Arrival on the wintering grounds, departure from the wintering grounds, departure from West Africa, and then arrival back to the breeding grounds itself. And then what we did was we used some quite complicated and exciting, I think, statistics to look at the relationships between the timing of each of these events and the relationship to the arrival back to the breeding grounds. And what we found was that despite its reputation as the harbinger of spring, bringing the good weather conditions with it, actually, the departure from West Africa was by far the most important event in determining when cuckoos arrived back to the UK. It accounted for about 78% to almost 80% of the variation. So events occurring 5,000 kilometres away are much more important than events in Europe and Britain, weather events in determining when the cuckoos get back. Equally surprising to us was that the timing at which they complete the southbound crossing of the Sahara accounts for 20% of the variation in that event. So actually, the speed at which they migrate across Europe and across the Sahara after they leave us in autumn, it's actually summer, after they leave us in the summer, is the second most important event in determining when spring in the form of the cuckoos comes back to these shores. Then the third most important event was indeed speed of migration across Europe, which accounted for about a ninth of the variation overall. So there might be some truth to the old adage after all, but nonetheless, not as much as we thought. So why should this be? Well, we think the answer lies in the frontal system known as the Intertropical Convergence Zone, or ITCZ for short, which is represented in this map as this purple line, which I hope you can see going across. And then we've got in dark blue and green, we have the heavy rainfall, which is associated with this frontal system. And if I could just set off the animation. Oh, getting old. You can see the purple line moving northwards, taking the heavy rainfall into West Africa in the northern spring, before receding in the northern winter, taking the rainfall into southern Africa. Then another annual cycle. You can see as the ITCZ moves northward in spring, the rainfall is coming with it, and then it's just reclining after the summer back to the southern hemisphere. So some key points on the timing of migration. Departure from West Africa is the prime determinant of the arrival to the breeding grounds. The onset of the rain in spring there is determined by the movement of the ITCZ, and that means it's determined primarily by variation in solar radiation intensity across the Earth's surface across the year. So in other words, the way the Earth is tilted as it moves around the sun determines the amount of sunlight energy which is hitting different parts of the Earth, and that's driving the ITCZ. And that means it's invariant with respect to global warming. So in other words, it doesn't matter whether it's a few degrees more warm here in the UK, the ITCZ is still going to be moving on along its normal annual cycle. And what this means is that rains produce a burst of when it arrives, rains produce a burst of insects that have been lying dormant during the dry season. It's a process known as estivation. It's very highly seasonal. You get massive dry periods, and these insects survive, adult insects, by lying dormant. And when the rains come, they come out. You can see young boys coming out to nights in the streets with a washing up bucket to collect the termites in some cases. And then this big burst of insects can fuel the migrations of these birds over the Sahara. Obviously, also the rain is going to cause greening of vegetation, and then foliage-eating insects are going to come, but we think that happens too slowly and too late to be of interest to our cuckoos, or to be of prime interest to our cuckoos. And the result is that the timing of the rains is therefore determining the stopover quality and constraining, we think, the arrival of the cuckoos back to the UK. And that's, as I mentioned, not related to global warming. So to look at the consequences of this, we looked at the relationship between the timing of migration and mortality. And to do that, we went back to this graph. And what we did is we looked at the 3 annual cycle stages which occurred after the events which are most important in determining when the cuckoos get back. So after the southbound Sahara crossing, we have the migration through tropical Africa towards the wintering grounds. After departure from West Africa, we've got migration across the Sahara and through Europe. And then after that, we have arrival back to the breeding grounds. And when we look across these 3 different stages, we see that the birds which were earlier in the previous migratory event were more likely to die during each of these stages. So what we think is happening is that these birds are having to take greater risks to try and get back early enough to be on the breeding grounds at the right time. And this might entail doing things like migrating with less fat than they would like to, which means that they've got a greater chance of, if they meet a headwind or something, of dying than they otherwise would. And this increase in mortality is very likely to be contributing to the population decline that we've seen. So they're basically under timing stress. I hate it personally. And the cuckoos seem to as well, but they suffer even more than I do. In contrast, at the end of the breeding season, when the birds leave the breeding locations, we find that those birds which left later were more likely to die in the subsequent stage of migration. And this is particularly the case for lowland birds. And we think what's happening is that these birds that are coming from the places where caterpillars have declined the most, the food source of the cuckoos, fewer caterpillars means thinner cuckoos, means a greater chance of dying on the next migration stage. So this means that conditions in the UK are probably impacting the population negatively as well. So basically they get off to a bad start and it only gets worse. So to summarise what's happening off with the cuckoos, we see that mortality of birds using the autumn migration route via Spain seems to be linked to population decline. We've seen that habitat loss during the midwinter doesn't seem to be critical yet, but it doesn't mean that continuing habitat destruction in the Congo is going to be all right. And we've seen that there's a constraint of timing on the timing of spring migration in West Africa, which appears to increase mortality risk, including, very surprisingly, during the southbound migration. So our plans for cuckoos for this year and beyond, we're going to be tagging a new sample of birds split between northwest Scotland and the south. I've already explained in the south we're tagging birds because we want to see what's going on with birds, but from places where birds take both routes. In northwest Scotland, obviously that's right in the heart of the increasing zone. We want to see whether there's a difference in survival, in adult survival between the areas where cuckoos are declining and those where they're doing well. We're also started it last year, but we're continuing to trial GPS accuracy tags, which download information via the Internet of Things, and this will help us get much better data on ranging behaviour in the UK. So the Doppler PTTs that we use give brilliant information across the annual cycle, but it's not really that accurate enough for habitat use. So there might be accurate individual locations to within 500, maybe 100 metres, maybe a kilometre. To show you how good GPS data is, so geolocators told us that nightingales were probably in England. This is a bird which had a territory in farmland near Methwold Hythe in Norfolk. You can see its territory is concentrated in the western part of this tree line here, but it's made excursions up the tree line and into perpendicular adjacent hedge into the territories of neighbouring birds. So we get to see not only where it is, but exactly where it is and what it's doing, which is total contrast. We've also used these tags thanks to funding from very close to here on Swifts, which has enabled us to look across, 4 different places: Beijing, Northern Ireland, and Great Yarmouth, which is where BTO did our work, and Ghent, combining data from different places. We've got incredibly detailed home ranges of these birds, which shows, you can see the scale bars with 20, 40 kilometres, 10 kilometres on the ones at the bottom. What the large home ranges these birds do, but we've also been able to look at home range structure, and we found that they use foraging hotspots within them. And relating this to the habitat variables, we found that wetlands seem to be particularly important. Right over there, wetlands are particularly important for these foraging hotspots. It looks from this analysis like agricultural land isn't important, but that's because we only were able to classify it as agricultural land. When you look at detail at what's going on, actually, a lot of the hotspots are in agricultural land, but only in oilseed rape, which is a surprise. I had no idea, but they produce pollen beetles and a couple of other insects which come off, and that seems to be incredibly important, particularly in lowland areas for swifts. So we're learning a lot about resource use and ranging behaviour of these birds using these much more accurate tags. And by using them on the cuckoos, we want to understand the impact of habitat quality here in the UK on subsequent survival and migratory performance, because I said that the late birds more right to die, suggesting that they're limited by conditions here. So we need to know what impact habitat quality has, and then that will help us to design habitat interventions for head-starting cuckoos. So I said they got off to a bad start. We want to give them a good start, and then see whether we can alleviate some of the problems that they're in. So advanced migratory timing, and just basically get them off to a good start and reduce mortality overall, and hopefully that could help the population. Another thing we're going to be doing is continuing our analysis of what we call the global cuckoos data set. And this will help us to plan globally optimal migration, optimal conservation strategies. This is data which is collected not only by us at the BTO, but also projects that we've helped to facilitate in Bavaria, Belarus, Mongolia, China, places like that, as well as data from other people, Copenhagen and the Max Planck Institute. And when you put it all together, you get a map like this, which I hope you'll agree with me is, well, it certainly is mind-boggling 15 years ago. We would never have dreamt of getting anything like this. You can see we've got in pink the clockwise migrations of most of the birds migrating from Europe. In pale blue, we've got the anti-clockwise migrations of birds from the UK migrating via Spain. In purple, we've got the out and back migrations of most of the cuckoos migrating from Russia. And then in white, we have the migrations of cuckoos from Mongolia, China, Korea, and the Russian Far East, including Kamchatka here. And they all migrate south of the Himalayas, through China, south of the Himalaya. Then they make this fantastic migration over the Indian Ocean, like amber falcons, to the Horn of Africa, and then continue on to wintering grounds in southern Africa. These ones here in Namibia are these ones here from Kamchatka. And this is actually the longest land bird migration which has ever been recorded. I would show you it on Google Earth, but you need 3 different Google Earth slides to look at it. I don't even think it's possible to get much longer than this, unless they go around in circles, which doesn't make much sense. But certainly the displacement is the longest that has been recorded. And you've also got here some oriental cuckoos, which do something completely different, and that's that they winter in Australasia and the area just to the north there. And putting this all together is giving us a lot of information. We're trying to work out what the driver of these patterns are so that we can help to preserve these patterns. But also in a simplistic way, we can do things like, here's some sample tracks from Europe, and all of these birds from Bavaria, Belarus, other places in Europe, all stopped over in spring in this important stopover in Ivory Coast and Ghana. So clearly this is a very, very important area. If this was taken out, it would be a big problem for a large proportion of European cuckoos. Not only can you do cross-population within a species, but you can start to put them in a cross-species. We had a PhD student called João Guilherme who did this and found that the number of links that we're getting is increasing very rapidly, both for land birds and for raptors. So this is linking breeding countries and wintering countries. And this is really important because it starts to tell us which groups of countries need to start talking to each other, and where the funding needs to go to try and help breeding populations of different species. I think when João did it, we had 1,200 individual birds, giving 544 migratory links. That's just a data set that he could collate in a couple of years for his PhD. And this enables us to look at the gap species, as you can see here. And importantly, this tells us what the tracking priorities are, which countries we need to be concentrating on, so that we've got a more complete picture of what's going on. You don't actually need as many tracks as you might think to get a relatively complete picture of what's going on, but it does need to be evenly distributed across the important countries. So very briefly now, I'm just going to give you some conclusions. Tracking provides data that's very important for conservation in various ways. So that's annual cycle movements, patterns of migratory connectivity, links to demography and population changes, annual cycle scheduling and timing of events, and local movements to understand resource use. In the future, we need more studies using non-archival tags for identification of demographic drivers, but these are obviously much bigger because they transmit, or at least they have been much bigger because they transmit information. This sort of information for small birds could be got using the MOTUS network of automated receiver stations. If you had a couple of nice lines, one in Northern Europe and one in Southern Europe. But a new wave of tags, which is just appearing now, uses Bluetooth to talk to iPhones. And that could revolutionise our understanding, and we could start to get information on not just where they're going, but where birds disappear. In other words, like the cuckoos, we have greater certainty that they're dying, but nonetheless, we could look at mortality patterns using these new Bluetooth tags, which is something, again, that even a couple of years ago would have boggled the mind. GPS level accuracy tags, and these blue morpho tags are GPS level because they talk to iPhones that have got GPS. They tell you where the signal's being picked up, not exactly where the bird is, but that's still pretty good. They're increasingly important for looking at habitat use and resource exploitation so that we can plan conservation interventions. And then we've also seen the importance of collaborating, as ever, with other people, studying other populations and pooling data, both across populations and species, to maximise the conservation benefits, to promote cooperation for conservation action and for focusing policy discussions. Finally, I just want to finish by thanking all these people who've helped us in lots of different ways. All of this work is a massive team effort involving loads of people. And the Cuckoo Project in particular is totally reliant on funding from individuals, or almost totally reliant on funding from individuals, and wouldn't happen otherwise. And then lastly, just thank you very much for listening, bearing with me. Thank you very much.
We're going to do question time. Thank you very much. With Nature Recovery, and the whole theme of this migration festival is to kind of talk in depth and in detail about all the things, Chris has been focusing on and the BTO work that's been carried out over many years. And I just think that level of detail is so important with, those statistics that we saw at the start, 99% decline, 75% decline, 86% decline. It's a bloody nightmare. Just massive thanks to the BTO and all the work that they're doing. Has anyone got any questions for Chris about the work? Mr. Mark.
I asked some questions about the cuckoo.
Cuts, yeah.
Are they all male?
Almost all the ones we tagged are male, and partly because they're much easier to catch, and then partly because the first female we tagged didn't do very well, taking the precautionary approach the license givers said they couldn't tag anymore. But actually now the tags are smaller, they will let us, and we will start with GPS tags, but we didn't want to do that with the Doppler PTTs because we didn't want to have to start dividing our data set up.
With the females having almost feces status.
That's have you seen our latest pattern?
Gentes, whenever you want to pull.
But we've been involved in a new population genetics.
No, to do it on the microphone, just
Sorry, we've been involved in a population genetics study, and actually, it's not the case at all. So what they discovered using our samples is that actually the egg genotype is determined by just a couple of genes on the sex specific chromosome, and that the population structure is not determined by gens, but it's much broader and actually corresponds, as a paper which is getting a bit of a hard time, but nonetheless shows that it actually corresponds to broad populations and actually migration strategies closer than it does to gens. Gens is very flexible, and it's likely that birds have switched, individual populations have switched between hosts rapidly, which makes sense because of the evolutionary arms race between hosts and parasites.
Explain a bit more.
Yeah.
What we're actually talking about is if for example, you're in pool, the female cuckoo there is preying on the reed warblers.
Yep. Parasitic, yeah.
And as we lay eggs that fall reed warblers, she could try a few other things, but they're much less likely to be successful. So, for example, you can't successfully put an egg in a song thrush's nest because it's thought over the evolutionary time song thrushes have worked out to stop it. So that means that she has to be very specific in the style of egg she lays, which then questions is she a different species? Yeah, and it's never been able to be determined with the males if there's any difference in them at all.
Yeah. Well, yeah. Although that's got more cloudy in recent years as well.
I think there's some Hungarian research in there into the cords.
Yeah,
and also just through conversation I've heard that they those that tend to specialize in wet areas here tend to migrate via wet areas as they go south.
Yeah,
that's not a scientific piece of work. That's just
I think that probably wouldn't hold up, but I know what you mean.
Well, what the question I'm really asking is, if you were able to look at the females more, you could probably work out a lot more about the fine detail. So you get the broad detail from the male, but you get the fine detail. So, for example, our Dunnock specific females creating this. But what you're telling me is that that they can adapt their egg laying to other.
It looks like it's been quite rapid. It's quite flexible. Not on an individual level, of course, because obviously they're born being able to. They're basically born with mimetic eggs, which mimic the host's egg. But the hosts are under selection to be able to distinguish finer and finer. So you get more and more clever forgeries by the cuckoos, which can basically fool better, more discerning reed warblers, for instance. But it needs to be flexible because not every reed warbler cuckoo is going to come across a reed warbler, for instance.
So it's a great book, is it? All
Nick Davey, my PhD supervisor, is the expert on the breeding biology.
I didn't know that. He showed that the different young birds could only produce the alarm calls, or could only understand the alarm calls of their particular parent species.
Yeah, and they show some really funky stuff where they actually quantified the stimulus that individual chicks calling and their gape area and things like that gave to the parent to bring food, and they showed that cuckoos were only mimicking it but actually creating a super stimulus. So they were basically mimicking more than one brood of very, very hungry chicks to drive these wrens, reed warblers, whatever, into distraction to get them to bring more and more food.
I would recommend the book. It's a marvellous piece of work. That'd be in the top 10.
What's it called again? What's what called?
The book.
Oh, he's done
The cuckoo, isn't it?
well, he's done a few, but the more popular one recently is just called the cuckoo. Yeah,
Cheating by nature.
yeah.
Cuckoo cheating by nature.
There's a few if you look for Nick Davies as the author.
Magnus.
I have a question that's related to Mars one. I was very intrigued by the big difference between the fates of Scottish and southeastern English cuckoos and the migratory divide.
It's not the difference between Scotland and it's the difference between birds taking the two routes.
But I was wondering if there's a difference in are they parasitizing different species in those two different areas? Could that be part of the story?
Yeah, I mean they are to some extent. Certainly, reed warbler has become a lot more common host in the south and southeast, and they don't exist outside England hardly. But we don't think that's related to the population decline because actually the biggest declines are in areas where reed warblers have increased the most and where cuckoo parasitism of reed warblers has declined. I've actually got a bit of a theory on this, which it hasn't been borne up yet, but it may not be true, of course. But I think there might be. So basically, because other hosts are breeding earlier, reed warblers are a much later breeder and they're becoming increasingly important. And although there's not a direct link, if parasitism of reed warblers, which is obviously a very common host in, say, Belgium and Holland, where we know also some birds migrate southwest, or probably all, but maybe all birds migrate south. I can't remember now. I think there's certainly some. It may be linked to reed warbler parasitism, may be linked to this southwestern migration route. And if so, that could be why this route persists, despite it being bad. So they have to do much better if they breed on reed warblers than they breed on dullets, because dullets are breeding too early, but they suffer on migration. It's what would be called an evolutionary trap. So basically, they're buggered. But they don't.
That is scientific.
Yeah, that's the way I like it.
So what's the main host species for the wires in?
Mostly meadow pipits, but due to reforestation, increasingly dunnocks probably, because you've got deer exclosures, which means that certainly some of our tagging sites that we went to 15, 12 years ago, you can't tag it anymore because the vegetation's too high. And that's possibly also why other species such as garden warbler are doing much better in Scotland than they were before. And we've got some interesting and very interesting initial tagging results. Unfortunately, there are buggers to get tags back from, but we've got a few tracks from Scotland and one from England. The English one did what we expected based on ringing recoveries, and it went to Ghana. But the Scottish ones, one of them went to Ghana, but two of them went to Nigeria, which is what Scandinavian birds do. So it may be a situation like the cuckoo, where we've got Scandinavian birds in Scotland and other European birds in the south.
Any other questions at all? No? Cool. Thank you very much. Another round of applause for Chris.